Thank you so much for everyone joining us this evening. My name is Heather Gleason. I'm the Director of Planning and Construction for the Chicago Park District. And we're really glad that you could spend some time with us this evening. If we could go to the next slide. Thank you. We just wanted to explain a little bit of the agenda and the purpose for this evening's discussion. First, we're going to do a brief introduction of the team members that we have with us this evening, and then we'll set some ground rules for our discussion. Then we will also have Eilish Tuffy from the Department of Planning and Development at the City of Chicago, who will review some of the project background, as well as our consultant will discuss historic preservation and some heritage review of our site this evening. We will discuss existing conditions at the east panel of the Midway Plaisance as we find them on the site now, and then also provide a little bit of a site analysis for you. And then we also want to introduce some concepts around universal play, which will be a big theme as we go forward with this project. And then lastly, we'll discuss some of the proposed site improvements. So we did want to have a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We will have opportunities for Q&A throughout the presentation as well as at the end of the presentation. So periodically we will stop after a section and present a poll question where we would like to get your feedback. We will also take some questions at that point. We are going to be taking questions from the Q&A feature this evening. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, if you haven't used it before, if you click on the little dialog box that says Q&A, you can enter a question there. If you don't get a response right away, don't worry, because when we do those pauses part of the way through the presentation, we will take questions from that Q&A and answer them. And so we will work forward from there. If you have any challenges with tech support, as we clearly did at the beginning of this meeting, the chat feature is what that will be used for. So we do have someone standing by to help anyone who's having trouble using any of the features. So feel free to put a question in the chat and Paul will help you. With that, the webinar is being recorded, and then we will also upload this recording to the Park District's YouTube channel. So if you can't stay for the whole meeting, or if you know people who weren't able to attend, it will be available later for people to view. Again, we will try to answer as many questions as we can this evening about the proposed project on the east panel of the Midway Plaisance, and only that project. So we're going to stick to that topic this evening. We'll have 85 minutes together, and then we will wrap up right around 7. So before we conclude, we'll make sure that we have an opportunity to hear questions live for anyone who's not able to use the chat feature as well. However, we do want to emphasize that this is just the first discussion on this particular project. We plan to have another meeting likely in May, and we will get details out to you as quickly as we can about that next meeting and the date. Next slide, please. So we'd like to introduce the project team that you're going to see tonight. Site was chosen as the project design lead for this project, and that was done through a public target market request for proposal process through the Chicago Park District. And what that means is essentially that 50% of the total contract and the leads representing that contract had to be represented by a minority-owned business or a women-owned business or a joint venture of the two. The project team that you see before you that Site has put together is made up of actually 100% certified minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses. Some of the projects that Site has done in the city, many of you might be familiar with, include things like the Pullman National Monument and Mary Bartlemay Park in the West Loop, among many, many others. And then the images that you see on the right illustrate some of the MBE, WBE firms that we'll get into here on the next slide. If we can go to that. And these are just the logos of the firms that are represented here tonight. So I'll start with our own, the Chicago Park District, who tonight is represented by myself, as well as Sarah White, an urban planner and landscape architect, and our main project lead on this project. As I mentioned, Site, represented by founding principal and president Ernie Wong, and Rob Raylan, our studio director and project manager, are here with us this evening. Terra Engineering will provide civil engineering and surveying for the project. Heritage Architecture Studio will consult on historic preservation of this important space. An Advanced Consulting Group will provide electrical engineering. GSE will also provide geotechnical services for the project, and Vistara Construction Services is our cost estimator, while Map Strategies will be the permit expediter. So that's a picture of the whole team. Not everyone is with us this evening, but certainly our very important principal of site design is here. And with that, I would like to introduce you to Ernie Wong, who will take over for me from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. So it is really wonderful to be back working at the Midway Plaisance. If you all are familiar with some of the work that we've done, the South Winter Garden was done close to about 10 years ago. But really, we want to talk to you about the engagement and how we'd love to engage with everybody here. Part of this is really, we understand this and that there are a lot of voices here, that there's a lot of different opinions on what they think that this panel of the Midway Plaisance should be. We want you to be very honest about it. We want you to talk about the good experiences, the bad experiences. And we really want everybody to come to the table with an open mind, because not everybody's going to necessarily agree about this, and that's fine. We understand that people have different thoughts about how this space should be used, but we value everybody, and I think that's important that we listen to each other. Next slide, please. And so part of that will be being respectful to all the participants, all the organizers, and everybody with a different thought on how this project should go and how this space should be used. We want to be clear about what our intentions are, and we want to make sure that everything is, we're being very inclusive, and we take an action-oriented process with this. We also want to make sure that we are understanding who's not at the table as well. And so we want to continue to do outreach throughout the entirety of this project to make sure that people's voices are heard and how we're going to use that. So next slide. So the opinions that you're going to have is really going to be helpful for us as we start to design this space. It's an extremely important space. And, certainly this community has looked at this space over time. We want to incorporate your thoughts and feedback into not only the data collection process, but also into the design process as well. That's truly important because as we do this, we want to make sure that people are heard, and that the designs that we are providing eventually will start to address some of the issues that have been brought up. So with that, we're going to go to the project background, and I'd like to turn this over to Eilish to talk about this a little bit further. Eilish?
Hi, can you hear me?
We sure can. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. Sure. This is Eilish Tuffy. I'm a coordinating planner with the Department of Planning and Development, specifically in the Historic Preservation Division of the department. And we just put together a few slides to get everybody up to speed on how we got to this point, designing the Midway Plaisance playground. The project summary here that you're seeing, the memorandum of agreement that we are operating under currently started because in 1972, Jackson Park and the Midway were listed on the National Register. And as many of you on the call are already aware, there was a multi-year process triggered by the improvements in Jackson Park affiliated with the Obama Presidential Center. There were many public meetings, 11 over a period of 3 to 4 years. And as part of that process, the community participants in those discussions generated ideas for mitigation measures to accommodate for some of the change that was occurring in the park. The draft MOA was circulated to a whole host of consulting parties for comment. They reconvened to discuss the edits to those initial thoughts, and then the finalized MOA was approved by the federal government, the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation. And once that occurred in December of 2020, that MOA became a legally binding document. So from that point forward, we as the city agencies are beholden to continue the path and follow through on those mitigation measures. And the next slide should show the list of consulting parties. There were many, 97, And those are the folks who have been communicated with throughout the process, and including this Midway Plaisance design process. And then the next slide talks about the memorandum of agreement mitigation measures. You can see here A through H. The one that we're focused on this evening is stipulation G, and that's the design review for recreation replacement land at the east end of the Midway. And the next slide just hones in on the map of that area. What you're seeing in the bottom image, there is a red box outlined. That is the footprint of where the OPC project is going. And after various rounds of looking for potential recreation replacement land, the east end of the Midway, east of the Metro tracks, was selected. And in the bottom image, that's in the bright green. And then on the top image, which is oriented so that east is properly to the east, it's outlined in the dotted black line. And many of you know that this area has been subject to a lot of stormwater pooling and just a lot of drainage issues. And we found this to be an opportunity to improve this land and make it far more usable than what it's been in the past. And details about where we're at now and how this process is moving forward with site design are going to be outlined by Park District staff. And I will pass it over, I believe, to Sarah.
Thanks, Eilish. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah White with the Chicago Park District. And as Heather mentioned, I'm going to serve as project manager for this project. And I'm really happy to be here tonight, kicking off the design discussion and really excited to hear people's thoughts and questions to help us move forward. So as Eilish mentioned, we're working under the requirements of an MOA agreement. And there are very specific site improvements to this parcel of land that you see here that are required within the MOA. The first is the installation of a stormwater infiltration system to address some of the ponding issues that are occurring on site, limited regrading to return a symmetrical balance and some of the historic kind of grade elements of the Midway, the installation of a north-south path adjacent to the Cheney Good Memorial that will rehabilitate, again, a historic alignment of a missing route, and installation of a universally accessible play area that includes nature play elements. So we are here tonight to talk to you kind of about big picture conceptual ideas that we are starting to think about for the design of this space. And we're really looking forward to hear your feedback. And a little update on our process. So we're here, it's March 2022. This is our very first public meeting. This is when we are just going to start collecting input on the future development of the site. We will be back to you in late April, early May with some kind of developed conceptual ideas, more kind of site specific ideas for how all these things could lay out on the site. Looking forward to getting more feedback then, but really those plans are going to be really heavily guided by things that we hear this evening. So once we prepare preliminary plans, so after that early May, late April meeting, we will undertake a 45-day consulting party review as required by the MOA. And so you saw the large list of consulting parties. The preliminary concept plans will be open for those parties to review and provide comments. And after that 45-day review, we will sharpen our pencils and put together construction drawings, but we will not begin construction on the eastern end of the Midway until we receive written concurrence of the SHPO that the final design is consistent with SOI standards for treatment of historic properties. So there are, because of the MOA, a number of checkpoints built in to make sure that we are conforming to the requirements of the federal review process. And I think that's it for my slides, and I will hand it off to Heidi to talk a little bit about what we've learned so far in our research about the historic attributes of the property. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Heidi Granke. Here's my video on. I'm Heidi Granke with Heritage Architecture Studio and a preservation consultant on the team for this project. And I'm going to go into a little bit more depth on the historic preservation requirements for the project. I'm gonna go over the review that we did, the historical research, identification of the materials and features that are historic, and the treatment approach for each of those things. And then we'll just talk a little bit more about kind of the review process. So go to the next slide. So the Secretary of Standards and Guidelines are what we're supposed to be designing to in the MOA. We specifically call out rehabilitation as the treatment. There are 4 different treatments that we can have: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. We are doing rehabilitation here. There are several different guidelines that are put out by the National Park Service for different types of historic properties. Because we're working on a landscape, the guidelines that apply are the guidelines for cultural landscapes. So if we go back to the standards here, there's 10 standards for rehabilitation. The first 8 standards refer to things that are already on the site. Standards 9 and 10 refer to things that are added to the site. That is why 9 and 10 are specifically called out in the MOA, because we're adding a playground to a historic site. That doesn't mean that we get to ignore standards 1 through 8. We still have to address those things for those things that are still existing on the site. And we will use 9 and 10 for our guidelines for the new playground. Guideline 9 refers to adding things in a way that we're not destroying any other historic characters of the site. And 10 is that we add things in a way that they could be removed in the future. So the first step we did here was to identify any historic materials and features on the site. We go to the next slide here. So we reviewed all of the National Register nominations, the cultural reports that were done as part of the Obama Presidential Center. And there were 2 things that were specifically called out for the east end of the Midway Plaisance. One is the memorial, and the other is the berm and the railroad tracks. We'll get back to that. So there wasn't a lot of stuff specific to the east end of the Midway Plaisance. There was a lot of redevelopment that's happened further on the west side of the Plaisance, on the other side of the railroad tracks. There's a lot of stuff, of course, that's been done in Jackson Park, but there wasn't a whole lot of stuff specific to this spot. So a lot of the research that we were doing was actually looking for stuff that just showed a corner of this from the Jackson Park plans. Through our historic research, we were able to find out that the 1930 plan of Jackson Park shows this area in basically the same configuration that it is in today. The Goody Memorial was added a couple of years after that, and there really haven't been very many changes to this site since then. There's been some replanting of vegetation as it's been lost, but otherwise it's remained pretty much intact during that time. So the next slide. So when we're looking at historic landscapes, there's guidelines from the National Park Service. This comes directly out of the guidelines for doing a cultural landscape report. And these are specific things that we're going to look for in a landscape. Now, not all of these apply to every site. So the items that are bolded here are the things that we're going to be looking at most here on this site. So one thing I did want to note is one of the things on this list here at the end is archaeology. There already was a study as part of the Obama Presidential Center that determined that there was not archaeological resources on this site. So we're not gonna have to deal with that. So next slide. So I want to just talk through all of those characteristics that we showed on the last page and how they apply to this site. So the first thing is spatial organization. The Midway Plaisance has always had a strong access down the center of connecting both Washington Park and Jackson Park through there. And there's always been balance and symmetry of design between the north side and the south side of that access. So we want to maintain that in the design. That's important. The land use has been pretty consistent. It's always been used for recreation. We're adding a different type of recreation to the site, but we're still maintaining the overall use of the site as recreation. The circulation on the site. all of the roadways that are around this site, the railroad tracks, all of that has remained unchanged and is not proposed to be changed at all during this project. The pedestrian paths on the site, for the most part, are still in their historic patterns. The one exception is this historic path that connects the north and south on the west side of the site near the Cheney Goody Memorial. That has deteriorated and is not very, well, it's pretty much gone now. So we'll look at trying to do something with that. The topography of the site, there's two key things with the topography of the site. The berm by the railroad station is an important topographical issue. The other piece is just that it's a sunken lawn. This is consistent throughout the Midway Plaisance, is that we have a sunken lawn area. So we want to maintain that as well. So from the vegetation, there's three primary things that we're looking at here. We're looking at the boulevard trees, and then we're looking at the historic plantings kind of at the corners of the lot. You'll see in the kind of the green triangles at each corner of the lot here. And then there's plantings along the railroad track itself. Those are all historic groupings of plantings. We'll talk about the views and vistas to this a little bit more when we just talk about the existing site conditions. I'm not going to go into that here on this site. And then the small scale features is one thing we look at too. And here, the primary thing is the Cheney Goody Memorial. So we'll talk a little more about that later. So I did want to note there's three things that we didn't, that are not included as historical features on the site. One is the concrete and wood benches that are currently on the site. We did extensive research trying to figure out when those were added. They were added sometime after the period of significance. So those are not contributing to the historic character of the site. The boulevard sign, which is right along Stony Avenue, is also not historically significant. It's relatively recent. And then what's kind of become a wetlands area at the site, that certainly wasn't designed to be that way. So that's not a contributing feature of the site. So go on to the next slide. Okay, so this is the priority in order that we're going to look at the cultural landscape materials and features. This is all per those guidelines. So the first thing is to protect the historic features that are remaining. So our walks, the roadways, the railroad and the berm, the central axis and that symmetry and balance from the north and south side, retention of the Cheney Goody Memorial, and then the views, which again, we'll talk about later. We're going to need to do some repairs to the Cheney Goody Memorial. And then we're going to have to replace the missing path on the west side that goes to that memorial. Then the alterations and additions, that's going to be our new play areas, which we'll talk a lot more about later on. And then special considerations, we're allowed to make changes to the site for accessibility and health and safety. And here we're going to need to make some probably grade changes to a few areas of the paths to make sure that we have accessible paths both to the memorial and to the playground and to the open spaces. So, next. So I wanted to just talk a little bit more about the Cheney Goody Memorial. It's one of the earliest monuments in Chicago to women. It was two pioneering political women who served in politics. So it's really important interpretation that has kind of been neglected. So we want to do something here to highlight this again. So that's it for that. Next. Okay. So the review process. So as the preservation consultant on the preservation team here, I'm going to be working with the rest of the team, with Site and Tara and all of the other consultants to kind of keep all of this historic stuff in mind as we progress on the project. And then we're going to have our wide review projects of the project. So we have two 45-day periods when that will be sent out, which was already mentioned. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Rob, who's going to talk about the existing conditions on the site.
All right, thanks, Heidi. So just want to go through the existing conditions on this site. I know probably a lot of you are very familiar with it, but I think there's some things we can all learn. and really make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what's out there today. So our project area is bounded essentially by the one-way drives to the Midway on the north and south, so at 59th and 60th. We have the metro tracks to the west, which are raised and part of a earthen embankment along the west side, and then we have Stony Island to the east. And so we are essentially just looking from back of curb in within this location for our site. As you look through the site, there's some key views here we wanted to highlight. And so one of the things that it's kind of the first things we start to do is the arrival sequence at the site. And so how you address the site as you come under the metro tracks and what those views are like past the viaduct, and then also from Stony Island as you would be crossing to the park. Within the site, though, I think we all probably all agree there's definitely room for improvement. As Heidi had mentioned, we've had some drainage issues within the space, and you can see that there in the bottom left. There are some missing shade trees as it relates to the historic alley of trees that frame the Midway, and so trying to think about what we can do with those. We have the existing mixed-use trail here in the top left and some replacements of asphalt trail as well. And then Heidi had mentioned the Cheney Good Memorial it's in need of repair. I think we're all be pretty honest about that. And I think there's some great things that we can look at doing with that. And then obviously there's some site furniture and signage in this area as well. Additionally, there is some existing vegetation along the metro embankment that we would like to clean up that was as part of the park space. And so that could be potentially an area of improvement as well. So now we would like to do a little bit of engagement here. And so we have a few online polls that we have set up. And so we're going to be using this program called Slido. And this is a pretty fun way to gather feedback, and it's a great way to record and kind of see what others are doing. And so at this point, you can do one of two things. You can open your camera app on your phone and scan the QR code and go to the website, or you can go to slido.com and just enter 302-520. And so I'll give everyone a moment to do that and pull that up. What we'd like to do is ask a quick question about, what do you find important about the site that the design team should really know about? So something that maybe we haven't seen in some of our initial cursory reviews and our walking tours, something that maybe our surveyor or geotechnical teams might not know, or just, maybe Heidi hasn't seen in her historical research. It would be great to gather some feedback. So we'll leave this here for a moment, and hopefully this will start to populate here in a second. How about that? We aren't missing anything.
All right, and while we're waiting for this to fill in, I think I'll start off with a couple of questions that we've received in the Q&A box. So just as a reminder, this is one of the breaks that we're going to take to respond to questions and comments from our participants today. And so far we have 3. So I'm going to start with the first, read them in the order received. So the first, and I'm going to give this one to Heather, is we are so fortunate to have site design. Will there be electrical charging stations in Midway and throughout Jackson Park for electric vehicles like golf carts? Thanks. Heather?
All right, can everyone hear me? All right. Thank you for your question. So I want to stick with the Midway Plaisance this evening. Certainly we can consider other ideas as we move to other areas in Jackson Park, but tonight we're focused just on the Midway Plaisance. So Al, I don't believe we're going to be providing electrical charging stations for vehicles here. As Heidi just went over, we are constrained by the historic nature of this site and the agreement that we all signed with the federal government in order to make sure that the site is being treated in the appropriate historic way. And so we kind of have to stick to that rubric as we're designing the site. So certainly there's other opportunities that we can discuss elsewhere in the area, but probably not at the east panel of the Midway Plaisance.
Thanks, Heather. Next up, the MOA required community input, but the current designs do not take into account the community's request, as for example, through MPAC to leave the space free and clear. Please explain why the community request is not being respected. Given the water tables underneath the Midway, why not create a naturally enhanced pond in this area? Heather, I'd like to shoot this one to you.
Sure, absolutely. And I might phone a friend and ask Eilish to jump in as well here. But so the memorandum of agreement is a binding federal agreement. We don't have the flexibility to not enact what is in the federal agreement, which includes putting in a play space. And so that is the real reason that we can't basically just not include what's in the federal agreement. And the city's Department of Planning has a really good website that documents all of the different documents that went through the federal review process. So I want to turn it over to Eilish really quickly and see if I've missed anything or if she wants to add anything here from that process.
Hi, thanks, Heather. Yes, the website is exactly where I was going to direct people to. And if you just Google Jackson Park improvements, you will probably find it. Otherwise, it's within the Department of Planning and Development menu of options. But the final MOA is one of the very many documents that are linked there. And it's you can find it under October 30th, 2020, and also December 17th, 2020. And the very last page of that document before all of the consulting parties, it lays out the specific mitigation measures that we had the slide, those A through H options. And that is the language that says exactly what we as staff and city agencies are being directed to execute. So that is a document that we're following, much like Heather said, and it did include language about some form of a play space. And what design that takes is why we're here engaging with all of you to see how you want to best address that requirement and what you think that should look like.
Thank you. And I just want to follow up that there was a follow-up note from the original poster that noted that play spaces can be open. So that's something we can definitely take into consideration, I think, as we move forward.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So options are on the table for discussion.
Thanks, Eilish. Next question. Isn't the drainage problem because the area is a natural occurring wetland? Heather, can you speak to that?
I believe though that was also addressed during the federal review process, that there is not an actual wetland here, and that was considered as part of the federal review. Again, all of those documents, and there are many of them, live at DPD's website that Eilish just mentioned, and I will try to find it and drop it in the chat for everyone so that you don't have to hunt through the website. But that is something that was also looked at. A lot of the commentary that we heard during the federal review process from community members was that this was an area that was very wet, very muddy. When people wanted to play sports here, that was a big challenge of theirs. And so as part of the federal review documents that were created, that was taken into consideration and why addressing drainage was put into the plan here.
Thanks, Heather. I've got two more questions and comments in the chat here. I'm going to run these two, and Rob, maybe we can run through what came in the Slido, and then we'll move on with the presentation. So first up, just a note, missing parties for previous comments, Midway Apartment Building Corporation, Midway View Apartments. So we'll definitely add those to our list. And then last one, there are only 2 buildings between the viaduct and Stony Island. Are the residents going to get permit parking, or should we be inconvenienced? So a parking question. Heather, can you address this?
So this particular site, we don't have any plans to improve parking. We're really focused just on that park space. There is no parking there now. We're not planning on adding any. So the current condition that is there now is kind of what we'll be dealing with in the future.
All right, thank you. And thanks to everyone who responded to our Slido poll. I think we got some really good input here. I enjoy the wildlife that uses the ephemeral wetland. Keep the open space. I think we're hearing that a lot. Part of the historic design. maybe thinking about the embankment as a sledding hill, thinking about if there's the opportunity for a natural wetland, and others. So we will sort through all of these as we move along in the process and take these into consideration, and we'll provide a summary as part of our next presentation. And I'll be back in a few minutes, but for now, on with the show. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Sarah. So I just want to talk a little bit about play. This is actually kind of the fun part of the conversation, hopefully for everyone. Not that history isn't fun, but there's kind of two main areas of play that I would like to kind of review with everyone. And one is what we would call nature-based play, which some of you may be familiar with in the group. And then the second type of play we want to go through as a group is about universally accessible play design. And what that means. And so, as I talked about earlier, as part of the MOA, creating a universally accessible playground was something that was specifically listed. And there are, technically more than 1 billion people around the world that are disabled. And so that's something that we really want to try to help address. And this isn't a one size fits all approach. And so we're going to kind of walk you through some of our thinking about how we can really create a truly unique and equitable play space for all to enjoy. And so let's dive right into it. So the first element I mentioned earlier in this was talking a little bit about nature play. And some of you guys have maybe seen this before around the city. I know Garfield Park Conservancy has a great nature play space. There's a few others located around, but the idea is that including the use of natural materials, whether that's through the use of wood to create unique stairs or climbing opportunities, slides that utilize the natural slope and topography of a space, providing opportunities to incorporate landforms or different natural materials such as sand and stones, and the incorporation of landscape. But this opportunity to provide visitors the ability to manipulate their landscape, right? So this is something that's ever changing. It's dynamic. It's not necessarily what you would see at a traditional play space where we might have a little bit more plastic and steel. This is definitely more obviously natural in terms of its material, and creates a lot of more creative opportunities sometimes. So that's one of the things that we're going to be looking to incorporate into the future play space here at the park. The second thing that we're looking at is this idea again of universal play spaces. And this is really different from traditional or standard playgrounds, which use a lot of proprietary manufactured equipment, and it's targeted, for certain areas of certain age groups. But a universal play space, is really designed for a wide range of abilities, levels of effort, age groups. It's geared towards all, right? We're not just designing a playground for, 2 to 12. This could be a space that someone in their early 20s might want to use. And so the idea is that this is for all users. And so when we start to look at universal play design and looking at potentially different types of groups, these are the three kind of main groups that we start to target, whether that's folks that have a mobility or a physical impairment. So someone that might be in a wheelchair or have poor stamina or balance, maybe limited dexterity. Folks that might have some sort of sensory impairment, right? So maybe they're blind or visually impaired, or maybe hard of hearing, and then an intellectual impairments. And so really trying to develop a space that all these different people can use together, right? And challenge themselves as they utilize the play space. So a playscape design, right, that is truly universal and inclusive, needs to be accessible and truly inclusive for all, right? And so a couple of three main themes we're looking at, right, is a space that's free of any social or environmental barriers for people with and without impairments, right? So we want people to be able to enjoy the space together. So we're providing opportunities for people of all abilities to play alongside, and we want to provide an acceptable level of risk and graduated challenges, right? Because this is a space that also needs to challenge people to grow and to learn. And that's what's really exciting about this space, this space. So as we were going through our research, we started to find a lot of different things that we started to fold into what we're calling right now, for lack of a better term, our design index. So what you're looking at right now is our design index for different ways that we can address a truly universal play space. And this starts to, you start to see some commonalities when you look at this, right? So you have mobility and physical impairments on the left, and sensory impairments along the top, and the intellectual on the right. And you start to see a lot of overlap on how we can start to address these different users through these different methods of design. And so I'll kind of start walking through some of these design tricks that were not tricks, but designs tools that we're going to use to create this space. So one of the things we want to do is, from a design standpoint, is include a perimeter path. Why you want to include a perimeter path, right, is this providing this circuit. So this orientation path, right, can loop around the entire play area, and this provides opportunities for visitors to access on their own terms, where they want to access, when they want to access the playground. You're not just funneling them into one specific accessible ramp or one entrance to the playground. You're trying to provide multiple opportunities to enter for when they're ready. And so creating this idea of the circuit around the play space is something that we feel will be very important to the design. Additionally, we have to provide some level of orientation, these distinct nodes and visual landmarks. And so when we look at orientation, we want to provide a space that's multiple forms of orientation, whether that's through sound, touch, smell, and sight, or just visual landmarks. We want to have some level of compartmentalization, so we can subdivide these spaces into smaller zones, and this helps to prevent overstimulation, overcrowding, maybe an excessive number of social interactions. And so this is another way that we can help make this more accessible. And then providing boundaries. So utilizing different ways to provide natural boundaries within the space, so it's easier for users to navigate if they have or if they don't have impairments in the play space. Additionally, we're going to continuity. And so this is about transitions. And this is a little bit maybe more of an abstract concept, but we want to provide transition zones to help users kind of calibrate their senses as they move from one space to the next. And you'll see this sometimes in buildings where you have maybe like a narrow entrance and a long hallway, and it opens up into this big space. But we want to provide these opportunities to transition within the landscape, within the park, within the play space, so as you move from one area to another. Additionally, we think a lot about enclosure. How do we subdivide compartments and provide areas for a wide range of skills and risk and activity level? And so providing areas of refuge, right? And so that can be, for lack of a better term, an escape pod or a quiet area that we can provide to have that area from refuge where maybe a user might need to take a break, right? Maybe it's a little bit quieter, maybe it's a little bit more private, providing areas of transition, again, so we can recalibrate our senses as we move from one space to the next within the play space. And then this idea of capacity. So the space needs to be designed to have sufficient access all around it to the play elements. So for instance, if a child needed to lie down or wanted to perch or look out from, we could provide those opportunities within the space. Additionally, this is kind of just sound design, but this again goes into clear sight lines and viewing zones. And what's so important about this, right, is we want to provide spaces that are free and unobstructed movement for those that might be in a mobility device, and providing this continuously accessible surface all around, right? We don't want to have areas where some people are able to go and some aren't, right? We want to make it fully universal. And that means having latitude around these spaces for parents and caretakers to observe and to help out and let their, whoever they're with, challenge themselves within the space. And again, going back to capacity. And a lot of this with clear sight lines and viewing zones is important, not just from a universal play space, but it also comes down to good park design, right? We want to be able to see within the park and provide a safe space for all that visit it. Additionally, right, shade. We all know how important shade is in the park, especially in an area like this, right? And so in the inclusion of trees or having the shade to help mitigate the sun, but also maybe even help dampen the noise of the Metro Electric train to the west, right, or the adjacent cars that are driving by on Stony Island. So these green elements can really play a very important part within the space, but they can also add to different sensory experiences within the space as well. So signage, it's not just here are the park rules, don't break them. That's not right? We need to have signage within the park because there's gonna be a lot of things that ultimately are gonna end up within this playground that aren't a traditional slide or it's not a traditional swing, and it might need a little bit of explanation for maybe that older brother or sister or parent that's taking one of their their kids to the playground, and they need to kind of explain, like, this is why this is designed this way. It's designed to challenge these types of motor skills or encourage this type of social interaction, so you know how to use the space. And then additionally, looking at this idea of sensory, right? And so we need to provide different experiences. It's not just about gross motor skills and running around, right? But it's sensory experiences for sound, smell, touch, and sight within the space. But then also needs to be a comfortable space, right? And so try to avoid obtrusive elements that may disorient users. It's really interesting when you start to do the research. You're trying to avoid shiny surfaces, or maybe you're trying to avoid pairing certain colors like red with green or green with blue because you might have issues with being colorblind, or sharp and clangy sounds that might ultimately provide that auditory scare, or something that maybe just as simple as builds up static. I know we always get that static cling when you go down those plastic slides, so maybe we need to think about a different material. We are going to incorporate a slide so we don't have those static discharges. And then, ultimately, I think this is an area where we all probably gravitate towards, but it's ease of access. It's about providing free and unobstructed approach for people that are in mobility devices. But then there's also, means, right? So different play elements that allow for self-sufficient access and guidance, like hand grips, rails, and transfer platforms, so you can do it yourself. And then again, this I thought about capacity. So making sure again that we have sufficient access to move around these spaces within these different play elements, so everyone can be together. And then, finally, we want to make this interactive. So a couple ways that we can do that, right, is through contiguity, right? So the idea is that we want to be playing together, side-by-side activity, whether it's two kids or a kid with a caretaker. And so making sure that we're together in these play spaces, provide different levels of means, so levels of reach, including ground level seated height, elevated platforms, overhead activities. We want to provide lots of different means. And this might mean an older person within this play space enjoying this space as well. And then collaboration. So the idea of promoting teamwork and collaborative play for all users is something that's incredibly important. So this is just, I'll say a little, this is actually a lot. And I went through that pretty quick, but this is a lot of the principles and design tools that we're going to be utilizing when we start to develop this play space, because to be really honest, there's not a lot of spaces like this. And this is something that's really, I think, at the forefront of play and at the forefront of recreation. And frankly, it's the right thing to do, and what we should be incorporating into spaces as we move forward into every playground. So just want to provide a little bit of a background on universal play and just nature play and where we're headed with a lot of this. We do have another opportunity for to get a little bit of feedback here from the Slido. And so again, your phone should pull up from before, but if not, again, you can use the QR code or the number 302-520 if you go to slido.com. But we'd like to ask you, right, is, in addition to a lot of those universal play elements we talked about, nature play, what other design elements would you like us to keep in mind when we're looking at the site, and what else should be included within this park space?
Thanks, Rob, and everybody. Like last time, I'm gonna run through some of the comments and questions we've received in the chat during the last portion of the presentation. So first up, and I think that I'd like to send this one over to Ernie or Rob. Rather than a formal playground, how about building on the wetland and making an interpretive area? Rob, even if we can't keep the wetland, is there something we can do with nature play that provides this kind of interpretation?
Yeah, I think there definitely is. I think one of the things that we can focus on is, we're gonna have to ultimately deal with stormwater on the site, right? We just can't have a flat site. So there's opportunities definitely to infiltrate water into the groundwater and do groundwater recharge, aquifer recharge. I think that's something that we can incorporate into our planting design aesthetic. And that's something that can also be celebrated through the use of interpretive signage to talk about some of those methods, because this whole area is really on one big sand seam, right? It drains extremely well. We may not need the east half of the site, but the area does drain fairly well. So I think there is an opportunity.
Thank you. Next up, about a neighboring project, and Heather and Eilish, I'm going to see if you can answer this. How will the renovation of the 59 60th Street Metro Station impact the design of the east end of the Midway?
So I can start and I can bring Eilish in if she has any other comments. So certainly we will coordinate with Metra. They, I believe, are going through their federal review process now. Just so that folks know, we coordinate with the transportation agencies a lot. If anyone had told me how much I would be doing that as a park professional, I would have said, really, all the transportation agencies? But we are coordinating with Metra on their Van Buren street station federal process that they're going through right now. So I anticipate that we will be doing exactly the same thing here to make sure that all of the designs work together. The Midway site, as some of what you've been hearing from Rob and others this evening, is staying within its historic boundaries. My understanding of what Metra is doing with their station is providing ADA access and making it much more usable to the community. And so we should be able to work together to make sure that all those elements work together. Eilish, is there anything you want to add to that?
I would just add that this is located in our Southeast Planning region. So our Southeast Planning team, the staff that deals with projects in this part of the city, they are apprised of that Metra work, and they are working with Metra to do any types of reviews. That is not a project that I'm directly involved in, but if anybody needed me to put them in touch with someone, I'm happy to do so.
Thanks, Eilish and Heather. Here's the next one. I see a couple of notes popping up about parking in the Slido conversation. What about parking? How much will it cost? How many spaces? Heather, can you talk about how we usually address parking for park sites?
Well, I think I would, yeah, sure, Sarah, thank you. I think I would say that this is just a playground, and we do not typically provide parking for an individual playground. And we have lots of playgrounds in Jackson Park and around this area that do not have individual parking areas. That's not normally something that we do with a playground. So I think, I think the space, as many of you have pointed out, and I'm seeing it pop up in the Slido comments as well, is a smaller space. And so, we would not want to take up, we typically try not to take up park space with parking, because we want people to enjoy the features and the open space and the respite that parks provide. So we do have parking elsewhere in the area, and of course along the street that exists now, that I would imagine people will still be using.
Thanks, Heather. And here is the next comment. You have great ideas and plans that deserve to be a destination park and have a lot of use. Why not in front of a school like Earl Shapiro Hall on Stony Island, where it will be used every day? Eilish, can you speak to this one about this site selection?
Yes. So as part of that Section 106 and the Memorandum of Agreement process, there were numerous sites evaluated, and part of that process is you have to outline pros and cons, and then collectively with the consulting parties, the Midway East End was selected as the location for this. So, so this is where we're at.
Thanks, Eilish. Next comment, had you considered integration of designs for the elderly? Brightly colored, take a look at the Chinese public parks to encourage exercise within the elderly population. Take a look at the city's designing playground for the elderly, bbc.com article. Site design group?
I'll take this one. Number one, I will say I'm getting to be one of those elderly people that need to do all of those exercises that old Chinese people do, and I'm starting to really build into that. But the beauty of this, I think, is the universal design. I think is really exciting about this, and we actually have been working with some of the Chinese playground manufacturers who have been starting to do exercise equipment for elderly people in China, and so we're aware of that, and we think that that this universal access, I think, is going to be very productive towards that. That has been seen actually in some of the parks that we've already designed. Bartleby Park, we already anticipated when we did that there would be this differentiation between kids of different ages, and we start to see everybody in that play equipment, from grandmothers and nannies to little kids. So we think that's going to really increase as we develop this.
I'll just add one quick thing to that, Ernie. I think what's important to note and just recognize is there are so many generational households these days, right? Where you have a grandparent taking care of younger children and vice versa, not vice versa, but and I think that's important to recognize, right? Because you're going to have a lot of these opposite ends of the age spectrum within these spaces.
Thanks, Ernie. Thanks, Rob. Next comment. This piece of property is surrounded by 3 sides of fairly major traffic. How do you propose providing safety? Will there be a fence surrounding the entire area? You can use handrails and trails, but the community will not use an unsafe space no matter what is on the play space. And this space is supposed to be for community play space replacement. Rob, can you talk a little bit about how safety will be incorporated into the design?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things related to safety. I think, obviously the first is, I think you hit it right on the head, right? Is we want to make sure that we're not providing opportunities for a kid to dart out in the street, right? So there's a lot of different ways that we can incorporate additional plantings. Maybe it's in some fencing in some areas. Maybe it's the way we orientate the paths and how we locate the play space or other program elements within the park, so that we try to mitigate that. And then also in response to safety, I think it's also clear sight lines into the park. It's providing focused areas of entry into the space. And so there's a lot of different things as landscape architects that we do to try to make sure that we provide as safe a space as possible. And we'll be continuing to, I think, explore and evaluate that as we go through the design process. And I hopefully, at the next meeting, you can start to see how that starts to develop and comment on that.
Thanks, Rob. In the interest of time, I am going to suggest that we start the show. We will continue to accept questions and comments in the Q&A box. And I just want to address, I see one person has their hand up in our last Q&A. We will open the floor for a little while for spoken comments for anyone that is unable to use the Q&A chat function, but we do encourage you to use the chat function. Thanks, and I'll see you in a minute.
Thanks, Sarah. So now that we've talked a little bit about the historic side of things, we've talked about, what we're defining play, whether that's nature play or universal play accessibility. Just wanted to touch base a little bit on what all this means from a site improvement standpoint. Some of these graphics might seem a little similar to what we talked about, but I want to explain, I think, the reasoning why, because this is kind of starting to set the stage for where we're going from a design standpoint. So one of the things as designers we all like to do first is, develop this program diagram. It's like, what are all the things that we think we need to put within the space? Start to lay them out just in general terms, so we can, before we get into the design and really start getting into the nitty gritty. And so as we kind of look at this, there's a couple things, and I'll start maybe looking at the outside, and we'll work our way in. So maybe we actually start around the metro embankment. I think one of the things we want to look at, right, is this idea of cleaning up the vegetation along the metro embankment and making that a little bit more useful for the park space. Additionally, right, we want to look at restoring the Cheney Good Memorial, providing a north-south access to that from either end of the Midway, cleaning up the sidewalks for that area, reintroducing and fixing the tree alley, the historic tree alley within this area. And so that means not just planting new trees, but the right tree, right, the historically appropriate tree, including the universal accessible play space, providing a design that respects the axial arrangement of the Midway, plantings at key corners. And so there's a lot of different things that we're going to be starting to work our way into the design. And some of that's starting to, show up in some of these program elements that we'll kind of walk through here. We want to provide a little bit of a visual to that so that we're all on the same page, right? What do we mean when we talk about restoring the mixed-use trail with an alley of shade trees, right? Well, this is starting to look at the, a nice section of the Midway in early fall, and that rhythm of trees, the multi-use trail or sidewalk that runs down that, right? Reestablishing that is something that is going to be very important to the project. Providing this connector pathway and restoring the Cheney Good Memorial. And this is, we just had to put this image in here. So I believe the image on the left was from one of the newsprint stories from when the memorial was first dedicated. And then this was last year. And so, there's a lot of TLC that can go in, I think, to bringing this memorial back to its glory and really, celebrating women's history within the park space. And so that's something that we're going to be making sure is a key part of our design. Making a more appropriate vegetative buffer along the metro tracks. Right now, we have a lot of scrub brush and overgrown vegetation. How can we plant more native plant material or plant material that may have been more in keeping with the original designs and make sure that that's more of a key feature within the space. Adding in ornamental plantings that are sensitive to the historic nature of the Midway, but also kind of help frame spaces. Like we had mentioned, this idea of providing safe areas into the park and concentrating entrances, but also safe sight lines. We want to be able to see through the park, right? We just can't be putting these large shrubs that block views in and out of the park. So that's another thing that we'll be looking at within the space. Upgrading concrete or upgrading sidewalk pavement, making sure we're providing access to the Great Boulevard signage, that interpretive signage within the space. Providing an open lawn, I think is sometimes as designers we overlook that, but just simply as an open lawn and a flexible space is an incredibly powerful design tool and program element. And then ultimately, this idea of inclusion of play, whether that's through nature play or providing universally accessible play areas and play areas that foster engagement, cooperation, and truly equitable play for all those involved. Enhanced site furnishings, right? And so we're going to be taking a whole new look at that. Upgrading and replacing a lot of the benches that are out there currently. I saw a comment earlier about bike racks. Yes, we will have bike racks. And so, trash cans and appropriate lighting within the space to make sure that, again, it is historically respectful, but also safe as a park space as well. So those are some of the program elements that we're going to be incorporating and thinking about as we get into the design process. And with that, I believe, Sarah, we are entering back into the Q&A section.
All right, great. Well, I've got two questions, comments in the chat right now. And I've got one person with a hand raised. So we'll start with the chat. The first one, comment, both sides of the metro embankment are good slopes for sledding. So it would be sad for local neighborhood children to lose that space for their winter fun. Leave plenty of empty space for sledding along the east side of the embankment and don't build any sidewalk north-south near the embankment. Okay, so we will absolutely keep that in mind. And the final question in the chat is, how will the visual formality of the Midway be maintained with the additions? Will original planting designs be used? Syke, can you start with this one, and maybe Heidi can contribute as well?
Yeah, I think the first step is the overstory, right? And so it's looking at what was what the historic plans were, how they were prepared, what types of species for those trees that were historically used. We've done some other projects along the Midway to infill trees along there in the past, and so that would be kind of the first step is period accurate trees that are in line with the design aesthetics of the Midway. I think the second piece is really the understory, and that is about respecting that axial design. And I think it's a little bit more about having quiet plantings is a nice way to put it, right? It's not something that is really trying to be too showy, but it's about helping frame the space along that geometry, that axial geometry. And Ernie or Heidi, if you have anything to chime in on, feel free.
No, I think you did pick it up. Thanks.
Yeah, you got it.
All right, a follow-up note on that from one of our participants. Historically, there were mature elms all along the Midway. All right, seeing no more questions in the chat right now, I'm going to open the floor to spoken Q&A. Again, this is really intended for folks unable to use the chat function, but I do see we have one hand up right now. Wendy Posner, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question, you have the floor. Or Rob, is she able to unmute herself?
Yes, she should be able to. She's still there.
All right. Wendy, we'll check in with you one more time. You may have walked away. I think you put your hand up a little while ago. So one more note in the chat here. Coyotes use the space to cross between Jackson Park and the train tracks. Have wildlife folks been consulted? Heather, can you take this one?
Sure. So we are just at the very beginning of this process. So this is the first time we're coming forward to talk about all these things. So all of this information that you're all providing us about coyotes using this space and this being an important sledding hill to children, all very relevant information for us to take forward. And we can definitely add the wildlife groups, Audubon and others are partners of the Park District. So we can certainly do that throughout our review process and design process. So thank you for letting us know.
All right, seeing no more questions in the chat and no other hands up, I just want to give one more opportunity for any questions or comments before we move to next steps.
Wendy did raise her hand again. I
Okay, Wendy, I'll give Wendy one more shot. Then I've got Gloria Rowans and I've got a 773 number. So one more chance for Wendy. Last call, Wendy, are you there? Can you unmute yourself? All right, I'd like to move to the call-in number 773-947-9541. Are you able to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Is Heather, this is Heather. Is there a way to help them unmute? I don't know if our tech support can help folks.
Yeah, I am not able.
They might have to unmute themselves.
Yeah.
If they're on a phone, do they have to dial a star or a number or anything, Paul?
Oh, yes. So if they're on a phone, they have, give me 1 second.
All right, well, Paul, our tech support is looking into that issue. I'm going to move to the question that showed up in the Q&A. How will the playground be incorporated into the visual layout? Ernie or Rob?
Yeah, I think in terms of how the playground will be incorporated into the visual layout, I think the first thing is making sure that we're being respectful of the axial nature of the Midway. And so that's kind of the one way that we're going to be doing that. I think the second way is we want to make sure that it feels that it's within the park. I think we would have all failed if it feels like we just dropped this playground in the middle of the wall and said, here you go. That's not necessarily how we're trying to do this, right? And so whether that's the incorporation of landscape material along sides of that, or other elements to make it feel part of the overall space, I think is something that'll be incredibly important. But it's going to be about balance, right? It's making sure we respect that axial orientation, still providing open lawn spaces, flexible open lawn spaces. And I think that's kind of be the first step. But I think there's going to be some other ways that we're going to try to make sure that we address that.
Thanks, Rob. Paul, any update for our caller from 773-947-9541?
Yes, I am sending over the phone number that they need to dial.
Yeah, it should be working, sir. I'm not sure what's going on.
Okay, maybe we can move to the next one while we're waiting. Matthew Izota, can you unmute yourself and ask your question? Matthew's hand is down. Maybe he submitted a question earlier. Maybe.
Okay.
Press. Oh,
Oh, he pressed the wrong button, he said.
Oh,
So,
okay.
Matthew, feel free to try again.
Okay, and I see another note in the Q&A. With the historical character of the park, there's no way you can integrate a modern playground. It would look dropped on. So there's concerns about that. We'll note that. And I do just want to address, I see a note in the chat here that there are the comments in the Slido that have not been addressed. And so just so you know, we are collecting that information and we won't address them live at the meeting, but we'll compile them and address them as part of our meeting summary and certainly as part of our next presentation.
And Sarah, we can post that on our website. Is that correct?
Yep,
That-
we'll post a summary.
Yeah. Just so folks know where to go to look for it.
Yep, exactly. So, and Sophia maybe can post the link again in the chat to both the website where the project information is being hosted. So we will be regularly posting project updates. This presentation, a link to the recorded YouTube presentation will be there. And there's also a comment form there. So if you think of something after this meeting, question or comment, submit it there. And it will be monitored by the project team. All right, so I don't see anything else in the Q&A, and I'm sorry we weren't able to.
Yeah, I'm worried we didn't get everybody's comments.
Call in, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about next steps right now, maybe, and then we'll continue. And at the very end, we'll just make sure that no one else has any spoken questions they want to submit. So can we look at the next slides? Thank you. So we just wanted to let you guys know where we are hosting the project website. It is on the Chicago Park District website under featured projects on our capital projects page. The link has been posted a couple of times in the chat, so please look there. Like I mentioned, we'll be posting all project materials, recordings of the presentations, and so forth as we move along. So check back there for more information. There's also like I mentioned, a comment form. So if you think of something after the meeting, fill it out. If you provide your email, we will add you to the project contact list. So you'll get periodic updates about upcoming meetings and so forth when we have information to share. So a good resource there. Next slide, please. Here's the online form. This is the example, pretty easy. Please let people know it's there and it's a resource, and we will read the comments and we will address them as we kind of work through our community process. Next steps. So like I said, we're here in the first quarter of 2022, kicking off our design. We will be hosting our second meeting in late April, probably early May now as of the end of the day. That will be the second community meeting where we take kind of what we learned tonight and those concepts that we discussed tonight and apply them to the site. And we ask your opinion on different kind of design treatments for the new play space and so forth. And so that community meeting right now, we plan to host in person. So we're excited to get back out. and see you guys in person and kind of talk to you in early May. We'll of course be keeping track of, COVID as we kind of go along to make sure that we're doing it safely, and it's okay for us to meet. But right now we do intend to host that meeting in person. After we speak with you at that time, we'll start refining our designs, getting ready for our 45-day consulting party review, which we intend to host second quarter of 2022. We will update you as we go along. So we intend to come back to the community with the refined plan as we share it for public, as we share public notice for the consulting party review. And after we get comments from that review, we'll move into construction documentation, into our review process with the SHPO and IDOT. Again, updating the community as we go along. So you'll be seeing how we reflect all of the feedback that we receive through the process every step of the way. And finally, we intend to permit and bid the project in the fourth quarter of 2022, completing construction by the fourth quarter of 2023. So we've got a couple of more questions in the chat that I will address. Will future meetings be held in person? We're going to try our best to do so. And finally, can an explanation be given to expand on playground versus universal play space? It sounds like the perception is the old-fashioned playground like swings and slides. That's a good comment. Yes. Site design group, would you take this one?
Yeah, we can take it. I think the goal is about it. I think, providing this opportunity for equitable access for all, right? A lot of traditional playground equipment that you see is really designed for the ages of 2 to 12 years old. And after that, kind of that's it. And so the opportunity to provide play spaces that are designed for a much wider age range, that provide opportunities for people that might not necessarily have the same physical access or maybe have sensory issues. I think that's something that we want to continue to evolve and add to our design. A lot of playground spaces these days just have a simple, what they call a transfer platform, where you slide out of a wheelchair into the playground, or there's an accessible swing, and that's it. And that's the only accommodation that they have for accessibility or equal access. And I think that's something that can really be built upon and change. There might still be some traditional elements end up out there, like there might still be a slide or a swing, but it's going to be different from what a lot of other playgrounds look like these days, which I think will really make it a unique draw for the community.
Thanks, Rob. And I've got one more, and this I'm glad someone pointed this out. Under the Park District's featured capital projects webpage, on the Midway drop-down box, we state that we'll post on that page when meetings will take place. The posting of this meeting did not occur on that webpage, and that is true. And that was a coordination and getting the website up timing issue on our part. So we did kind of miss getting this meeting posted in advance. But now that we have kind of publicly advertised that this website exists, we'll make sure that all future meetings are up there in a timely manner as soon as they're scheduled. So apologize they weren't up there ahead of time, but they will be in the future. All right, 2 more. The possible play space designs has made me feel that a low density wood-based space with benches and low level simple structures could be an acceptable development of the space. Everything that was shown tonight is way too much. Make it much, much more simple and low key. Essentially a space to rest and relax with just enough bare minimum equipment for kids. And finally, would really like to see the universal design incorporate the wetland nature of the site. It is really wet most of the year on clay, not sand, naturalistic, not full of traditional play equipment. And that wraps up the questions in the Q&A chat for now. We're just right about at 7 o'clock. I would personally like to thank everybody for coming tonight and say that we are really excited to get going on this and really grateful for your feedback. And we think that this is, everything we heard tonight and everything we'll kind of discover through the Slido comments will make this a strong project. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
That's a wrap.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.